Oh, hi.
Hey,
How was your night go? Well, it's not your night, is it? How was your whatever time it is for you? How is it going?
it's very good. It's 1 p.m. here. Yeah.
Oh,
How
okay.
about you?
It is 6 o'clock now here on the West Coast I'm in Sacramento. So the 49ers, I don't know if you follow American football at all, but the
No,
49ers,
no.
it was the first time that they'd won all year. So it was a surprise, but a good
Oh,
surprise.
nice. Congratulations.
Yeah, they're now 1-9, but at least they have a win. So So the topic that we're going to go into here is this house would decriminalize all drugs. Now, my main reason for focusing on this, actually, let me see, I wrote out a little bit here. So the first point would be that drug enforcement in America has not worked. We've seen an attempt at criminalizing drugs and having this hardline anti-drug mindset for a long time now. And it is not working. The people are still addicted to these drugs, and they're not being taken off of these addictions by increased enforcement. In fact, the subpoint that I would say here is that drug enforcement often incentivizes addiction. And part of the reason for this is when something is legal or at least decriminalized, then it's just a thing that people do. But when something is illegal, all of a sudden there's this excitement, this nuance to what you're doing. Ooh, I'm going to break the law. And what we see is that it actually incentivizes a lot of people to go through it. I would give the example here of the Roaring Twenties and Prohibition. When the United States tried to ban alcohol earlier in the century, well, last century that is, it immediately created an underground market which skyrocketed and was unregulated and really unable to be prevented because all of a sudden there was this excitement and it's what pops up when you try and outlaw something. So what we're seeing in America right now is that the drug laws that we currently have are not actually successful. So this leads to my second point, which is that enforcement prevents cooperation. And this is actually quite important. And there's two reasons for this. The first reason would be because it targets racial minorities. And what you see in America is that the law enforcement is arresting minorities at a significantly higher rate for nonviolent offenses. Whether or not this is intentional or not, we can debate intentional, we can debate racism and everything. One thing that has become clear is that our drug enforcement policies are disproportionately affecting minorities, which prevents these minorities from believing in the rule of law in the first place or wanting to work with law enforcement in the first place. This also contributes to the distrust of law enforcement that you see from minorities toward officers or toward cops, which often skyrockets when you have a police shooting or something of a minority. They're already incentivized to distrust those cops, so they think it's just a continuation of that. So they're not working with law enforcement, and they're not wanting to do what law enforcement or the United States already has. The second reason that this causes a problem, that enforcement is preventing cooperation, is because when you tell people you are going to be put in jail or you're going to be penalized for doing these drugs, why would they ever tell us that they're doing the drugs? The goal of an effective system would be to help people rehabilitate themselves away from drugs, away from things that could be damaging their lives. But if we're preventing them from cooperating with us and doing that, we're not actually accomplishing this. So I would give the example, and the solution would be that of Portugal. And I think I had told you this earlier, but Portugal in the early 2000s decriminalized drugs. And what that means is they aren't saying, they're not having legalization as much. They're not saying this is a good thing and you can do whenever you want. They're saying, okay, we don't really think this is a great thing, but you will not be punished for having done this unless, of course, you were to have become so high that you then hurt someone else. If you did that, then you are still punishable for the offense, for hurting someone else. But the reason why they decriminalize it is because then they can work with the people who might have been addicted. So they have programs to have someone meet with counselors, to meet with treatment, to meet with these different groups. And then what they've found is that has worked so much better than anything they tried before. Drug addiction rates have gone down significantly. Sexually transmitted diseases have gone down significantly. And so overall, Portugal has done, and it's been tried in a couple other countries too, like the Czech Republic, and when they decriminalize the drugs, it winds up working out better than if you were punishing people for taking drugs. Mainly because it has created cooperation between the people and with the government. So that's my overall stance. Hopefully that's clear. Be interested to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so I'll respond to some of the things you said, then I'll make my case, some of which directly responds to what you say. Can you hear me, by the way? Oh, yeah, of course you can. We spoke earlier. All right. So the things that you identify, you say that drug enforcement doesn't work in America and that's produced some harms. I, of course, don't have to support the really bad drug enforcement that America has done. I would not support things like 3-strike laws, which arbitrarily punish those from minority races. I would not support the over-policing of local communities. What I do support is a similar thing that we have in Australia, where we have a 3-tiered system that is of the pillars of demand reduction, supply reduction, and harm minimization. And I can do all of those things while remaining drugs as criminalized. That is to say, I can go out and attack the cartels which are creating these drugs. I can reduce the demand for these drugs by providing support and information and prevention programs for individuals who may be at risk. And I can do harm minimization things by by helping people who come forward. Your claim is to say, well, who would tell the police or who would tell the government if they're saying they're doing something wrong? What I would point out here is that if you commit a murder, you commit a robbery, if you turn yourself into the police, the legal system also takes mercy on you because you've shown some remorse. The same principle ought to apply here. The next thing is to say, when it's illegal, people get mad and get grumpy because they want to be like doing the cool thing. That's not really an argument, because that is also an argument against all other laws. By that logic, you would not have a law against murder, for example, because if we didn't have it illegal, people wouldn't think it was cool and they wouldn't do it. So obviously that's not logic that works in totality. It has to be working with someone else, and I'm pointing out there's not enough to rely on. The final thing you point out is to say, well, the racial disparity in its enforcement. I don't have to support those types of things. That's actually just an argument to provide greater support and prevention programs for those communities. It's not an argument to decriminalize drugs as a whole. I'm going to make 2 primary arguments. The first is why consent cannot occur with consumption of drugs. And secondly, even if consent can occur, why there's a significant social harm that we shouldn't allow. So firstly, why consent can't occur. The logic for this argument is as follows. The government disallows things where consent does not occur. For example, sexual assault, where one party is not consenting, that is illegal. Similarly, with contracts where there is not sufficient elements of consent, those things are illegal. And thirdly, those individuals who do not have the capacity to consent, for example, children, we do not allow them to consent to things, for example, buying property or getting married. What I'm going to point out here is that the 2 primary elements of consent, that is significant information and the absence of coercion, do not exist in the consumption of drugs. Firstly, on information, I'd firstly point out that drug affects the way in which your brain operates. That is to say, drugs like MDMA increase your propensity to be aggressive. They physically make you aggressive and agitated and mean that you go and attack people. That is what's happening in Australia right now. We currently have an ice epidemic where people who are on methamphetamines go out and attack other people, because that is what that drug requires your brain to do when it's in your system. Secondly, even if that's not true, you're likely unsure of what the drug content has. Your claim is to say, well, it's harder for people to buy those things. In your world, you can just hide the illegal drugs that have been produced by cartels that have rat poison and the like in them, and there's no way of you to tell the difference if you're on the ground. So as a function of that, more people are going to die when they're taking drugs that have been produced illegally, even in a decriminalized system. Thirdly, the effect that the drug has on you is different from other people. So you actually can't gather information, because when you watch someone else take that drug, your experience may be different, and therefore you'll your decision will not be sufficiently informed. And fourthly, even if that's not true, when you take a drug the first time, that is not sufficient information to you to get drugged the next time. And the reason for that is that the same drug affects the same person in different ways at different times. A good example of that is alcohol. Sometimes when you drink alcohol, you're very happy, and sometimes when you drink alcohol, you become very unhappy. That is reasons to believe that you can't gather enough information. Finally, I think that even if that consent does exist for the very first time, it doesn't exist for the second time. So that's to say, when you're drinking alcohol or when you're taking drugs, you consume it, and then it changes the way in which your mind functions. And as a result of that, your consent is diminished going on and going on. So even if the first one has consent, the second one does not. And that is a reason to believe that the government should not allow it. And importantly, we don't allow consensual harm in the status quo. We don't allow people to kill themselves when they try to attempt that. We put them in mental institutions to protect their well-being. Secondly, on coercion, or the lack of trust. So those are reasons to believe why there's not enough information. There's like 7 of them. Now reasons to believe why there's coercion in the consumption of drugs. Importantly, for consent to exist, both of those elements have to exist. So if I can just demonstrate that one of them doesn't exist, that is sufficient enough reason to believe that you shouldn't decriminalize them. On coercion, the claim that I'm making here is that what is likely to occur is that when you decriminalize it, a market will form around it, and that is likely to be a legitimate market. That market takes the form of like advertisement and marketing, encouraging people to do those things. Importantly, I think there's likely to be a norm that says that you should be doing things to have fun when you go to a party. Like having alcohol at a party right now is a norm, and those people who don't do it are looked as weird, or they look as if they don't have as much fun, which means there's a social culture around you that is likely to coerce you and convince you to have drugs. Importantly, it's going to be around other people, and like the atmosphere will be where there's diminished consent, but also you're coerced into that instance because of the cultural norm that creates. Importantly, there's also likely to be a dependence that is created over time, or like addiction, or the very least dependence, which means that you feel like you have to be taking these drugs in order to feel happy or in order to enjoy yourself. That means that there is a coercive force there. Those are all the reasons to believe why consent does not exist with consumption of drugs, and therefore the government shouldn't allow it. Secondly, even if consent does exist, the government shouldn't allow it because the social harm is not good enough. And the reason why this is a sufficient argument to make in this debate is that governments don't allow contracts that are both parties sufficiently consent to, but they deem it to be something that is bad. So, for example, you could sufficiently consent to being whipped, for example, or like killed in public, but the government doesn't allow that thing to occur because it would be socially bad. So even when consent exists, the government can still step in. What are these reasons? Firstly, as I identified before, they change your mind, which is likely to have a series of long-term and short-term consequences. On the short term, increased aggression and paranoia and lower productivity, as drug users often have, means that you are likely to suffer. You as an individual are likely to suffer, and the people in your immediate vicinity are around to suffer. So that is things like an increased toll on the healthcare system, an increased spike in addictions, which means that public healthcare costs and also increased enforcement costs are likely to occur. Secondly, in the long term, all of the long-term side effects that drugs have, we actually don't see at the moment because we haven't allowed people to do them. I've got a list of them here. The first of them is depression, insomnia, lower concentration, lower happiness in general. These are things that occur even if you can use it safely right now. Over time, they get much worse and people suffer for it. And the analogy for you to believe this here is things like the encouragement for individuals to smoke back in the 60s. And what we saw is a huge spike in lung cancer about 20 years later, which killed 20 million Americans, 2.5 of which are not individuals who smoke, but they just got it from secondhand smoke. A likely epidemic is likely to ensue when you have all of these drugs operating in tandem. And importantly, they're likely to be mixed in a party scenario, which means that even if everything I said was untrue before, that they are safe in individual circumstances, when they're mixed together, it's likely to get significantly worse. Those are reasons to believe why that's the case I have.
Okay. Yeah, you have a lot of reasons there. I'm going to generally respond to most of them. I wasn't flowing every single individual one. But the overall point that I would say in response would be just the fact that decriminalization is different than legalization. Decriminalization would mean that you are saying there will be probably a fine. And this is what Portugal has done. There will be a fine if you've done this, but then we're going to work with you. It's going to be a really minor thing. We don't believe that what you have done is necessarily good, but we're going to work with you and we're going to help you overcome this. And that's what Portugal has found, and that's what they tried in the Czech Republic as well. They've also tried that in quite a few US states. And what they found is whenever they try this, the addiction rates go down, because what they're doing is they're working with the people who are addicted, and they're no longer turning those people into enemies. Now they can work together. If you turn someone into an enemy, why would they come to you? Why would they work with you? Why would they get better? Well, they don't. And that's why when Portugal tried it, they decriminalized all drugs. And the rate of people who were addicted to drugs went down significantly. Their rates of sexually transmitted diseases went down significantly. Basically, everything that they were having in I believe 2001, when they first accepted, or when they first put the policy in place, nearly 1% of their entire population was addicted to opium, which was significantly higher than anywhere else in the EU. Today, Portugal's drug addiction rates are lower than anywhere else in the EU. And the Czech Republic, the other place that has tried this, is also significantly lower than most of the countries in the EU. So that's my overall response to all of your points here, which is just, I would say, let's look at the countries where it's working, and let's talk about that. And there's a clear reason why, and it's because you're turning people into equals as opposed to trying to punish them. There's a significant difference between punishment and rehabilitation. When we take the focus off of punishment and simply go to rehabilitation, it works. You responded to this by saying that you can still focus on rehabilitation and everything, and that's what you guys have in Australia, which is acceptable to a certain degree. And yet, I would simply point you to the fact that if people still think they are going to be punished if they work with the enforcement, then you will have a significantly lower rate of them actually trying to work with enforcement. So that's why when Portugal did it, all of a sudden people were willing to work with them. They're like, okay, I recognize I have a problem. I want to get this fixed. I want to have help. And so they would work with the Portuguese officials, and it has been incredibly successful. Now, your points were first that consent cannot occur. Well, I have two responses to this. My first response would be, you chose. I understand that once you are addicted and you're on the substance, then you're no longer in control of your mind. But you still chose to take the substance in the first place. That is still on you. Now, what we can try and do there is help incentivize people not to take that drug in the first place. And that's what the focus of decriminalization would be. The second response I would have is that of incentivizing people. If you want this to be changed, if you want people to be able to consent, the solution would be to pick the way that stops people from taking the drugs in the first place. And the answer to that would actually be decriminalization. Your second point was that of social harm. Well, my response would be use does not equal abuse. Just taking a drug in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. For instance, you use the example of alcohol. I like that example. Just taking a drink of alcohol on its own is fine. Getting drunk on its own is probably fine. But if you then go and drive a car and kill someone, well, that is abuse. And that's where the danger comes in. So if you have taken something to the point where it turns you into a public threat, that is the point at which government can and should step in. So I would agree with you that there is a point at which government should step in. But the question is, how do we help the most amount of people? Do we punish them for what they are addicted to, or do we work with them? And what has been successful so far is when governments work with them. Decriminalizing has worked in the US states where it's been tried, and it has worked in Europe where it's been tried. I would advocate that we continue that even more.
So I'm just reading about the Portugal drug policy. Just a couple of things. Your claim is to say decriminalization is not the same as legalization. What you would need to prove is that there is a distinct narrative that is tied to decriminalization that I could also not co-opt. In addition, you say, well, you choose to do this thing in the first place. As I identified before with the 6 or 7 reasons, that choice is not an informed choice. It is not a legitimate choice. And as a function of that, we would not allow you to make that choice, and we would minimize the circumstances in which you have the option to make that choice. That is what we do. Oh, you've gone out, dude. Are you still there?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, I'm going to restart because I see I'm out too. I'm going to restart this.
You don't want to do a drill, do you?
Yeah, no, it's all good.
No, they do a 504, they want to drill in.
Again. Can you see me again?
Yeah, I can see.
Okay, cool. So
Yeah,
what were you saying?
So the choice thing I was saying is that even though that choice is made, it's not an informed choice, and the government doesn't allow that to occur. That is the argument that I've made. Importantly, that is not a choice that any sane individual would make. So, for example, if someone held a gun to your head and they made you choose to do something that was harmful to you, the government wouldn't consider that a legitimate choice. In the same way, I don't think this is legitimate there. Your next claim is to say, well, use is not equal to abuse. An example of that and the pre-response that I already gave to that in my first section is that different people respond to things in different ways. So it's actually unclear whether or not your consumption of the drug will make you lead to abuse. Importantly, you say the standard at which you would stop individuals from doing things is the standard at which they become a public threat. What I told you before is what MDMA and meth does is it makes you more likely to commit crimes because it makes you more aggressive and more angry and violent. That is what the drug does, which definitionally makes you a public threat. In addition, I've read up on this on the Portugal policy. So, for example, one of your big claims is to say, well, the HIV and STI rates have plummeted. The reason for that is that they had a needle exchange program, which was say no to a used syringe. And as you would know, sexually transmitted disease and HIV and AIDS get transmitted quite a bit by the reuse of syringes. That is an exchange program that exists in Australia right now, exists in public bathrooms. And you want to know the reason why they do that? It's because leaving syringes out in the open is a public health threat, and they would like to minimize that. That is not something that requires the decriminalization of drugs. What it requires is a reasonable policy interpretation to minimize harms to the rest of the community. That rest of the community is going to be harmed by your policy with increased rates in aggression. So what I'm pointing out there is that the benefits you've identified are not solely sequestered to the narrative of decriminalization. You need to prove something discrete.
All right, well, let's just do it back and forth then. When it comes to the question of decriminalization versus what you could also do in Australia, I want to talk about that a little bit here. The reason why those needle exchange programs started working is because people recognized that they actually would not be punished if they went and talked to the government about it. That's why they started taking part in those needle exchange programs. And so I agree with you that, yeah, you could do that in the United States already. And in a lot of United States states, they already do that. But it's not as effective as it could be because people know if they work with the government, they are at threat. The government is their enemy. And that's not as effective of a means as if we were working with them, which is what decriminalization allows you to do. This is why the states that decriminalize it and the countries that decriminalize it wind up having increased cooperation. And that's why it's more effective. And then when we talk about MDMA, now I would agree with you that MDMA is probably a bad thing, which in the vast majority of situations probably shouldn't be taken even once. But at the same time, there are people who are taking these. And so the question then becomes, what is the most effective means of combating that? And the answer would be, if you turn those people into enemies, it's not like they're going to work with you. We're not going to know who they are until after they've hurt someone. But if you can root it out in advance, which is what decriminalization allows you to do, that's when we actually have success. I'd be interested to hear, why do you think that punishment is more effective?
So as identified before, we have those needle programs in Australia, and they are effective. I'm trying to find the rates of effectiveness. I've only found the Australian one right now. If you can find the Portugal one, I'd love to hear it. It's in the Australian government document on health, on their drug policy, decrease risky injection behaviours by 74.1%. I don't know what the number is for Portugal. I've yet to find it, but I'd hazard a guess that they're about the same level. And the reason for that is this is not like, if your claim is that the government will see you as an enemy and treat you as an enemy if it's not decriminalized. It is not decriminalized in Australia, and the government doesn't treat them like enemies. And the reason for that is you can see empirically the way in which these needle programs are used. There's not that significant harm you're talking about. And secondly, as I pointed out in my very first speech in response to your arguments, that if you commit a crime and then you go to the police station and hand yourself in, the justice system takes mercy on you for handing yourself in. That same principle applies there. Similarly, there are institutions in Australia where you can get rid of addiction, and there's no harm to you by doing that. There's no reason to believe that those things can't exist on my world, because they factually do in Australia. As I said in my previous speech, you need to find out something that's distinct to decriminalization for all of these policies to be beneficial.
Well, I just looked up Australia versus Portugal. Let me see, what did I Google? I Googled Australia versus Portugal drug abuse rates. And the first thing that comes up is an article talking about how experts at the National Drug Summit argue that Australia should follow Portugal's policy and get rid of and decriminalize drugs. And they point out that in Australia, you are currently arresting, charging, and imprisoning nonviolent drug offenders at all-time high levels, which are, like I talked about in my opening, disproportionately young, male, and black. And so they're advocating that you do the same thing that worked in Portugal. And so this article, I don't know how qualified this specific author is, but it brings up some of the charts that I was already talking about. Like, for instance, drug-induced deaths in Portugal went from 80 per million, or whatever the number was, down to, looks like 16 per that same amount between 2001 and 2012. It's so, like, okay. Anyway, to come back to you, when we talk about Australia, I'm sure you guys have a lot of policies that are working. And one of the ones that I think both of us agree with is the idea of needle exchanges. I think that cooperation between people is incredibly helpful. But the question that we have to ask is, the people themselves, the ones who are participating, would they participate in this needle exchange program more if they feel like there is a threat of punishment, or if they are already aware that drugs have been decriminalized? And what Portugal found and what the Czech Republic found is that when people were less scared of the punishment, the retributive punishment that the government was inflicting upon them, they were more willing to cooperate. And so their drug abuse levels went down. And their rates of deaths went down. All these numbers go down when you decriminalize the drugs.
So in Australia, the needle exchange programs, you don't need to go to a government official. They're in public bathrooms. You just put it in the bin, like it's not something you have any engagement with the government with. But even if you did have to have engagement with the government, as I said in my very first speech, information campaigns, education campaigns can identify that if you come forward, we're not going to punish you, as is the status quo. Like, there's literally no reason to believe it needs to be decriminalized, because you don't provide an incentive for them to come forward. If I say, if you come forward and get help, we're not going to punish you, that's different. That's totally different to decriminalizing, because you've provided no incentive for them to come forward. Additionally, I read the article by the Sydney.
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you here. So what are you advocating then? Are you advocating that we say we're not going to punish you, but we want to work with you?
No, as I said in my first speech, if you're coming forward, there is a precedence in the status quo where if you commit a crime and you come forward, the criminal justice system takes mercy on you. That's different to decriminalizing the act altogether. If you're caught in the act of it, you would be committing a criminal act, because what you're doing is contributing to a social plague that harms other people around you who are innocent, and it also contributes to the illegal production of drugs industry by providing them with funds. Those funds are then funneled into other illegal activities. You're tacitly supporting those things, and you ought to be punished for that. Does that make sense?
Not really, because that's not what you see. When Portugal does it, when countries do it, they do see an increased amount of cooperation. They do see a decrease in drug abuse rates. They see a benefit to public health. So I don't see. I mean, I agree with you that government should not be publicizing, oh, we're going to punish you. We're going to have drug enforcement agency. We're coming after you, because obviously that doesn't work. And I think both of us agree with that. The question is just what decriminalization means. And I one of the reasons when we first talked about this topic, I didn't really want to defend drug legalization, which is a different principle entirely. With decriminalization, and I'll explain what Portugal has one more time, they still do consider it a problem. It is still an offense to have taken drugs and to do these sorts of things. But it is not to use America, it's not a felony. It's not an extreme offense. It's a finable offense, but at the same time, the government's going to work with you. It's not going to be punished. And that's the main difference is they went with that.
All right. Just so we're clear, is being fined a punishment?
A small punishment, yes.
It's a punishment.
It's like $100 fine.
So it's a punishment. And remember, $100 means quite a bit to someone who's in a low SES environment, who is, as you pointed out, male or racial minorities, and are poor as a function of that, which means that $100 could be crippling towards them. That is a pretty punitive measure for poor people, for the people you're trying to help.
Look, I agree with you. I'm not really sure what we're questioning here. We're questioning Portugal here. When they did it, they found that it worked.
Right. Are you advocating for decriminalization where you are not punished?
You're punished to a really minor level.
You're punished. And as I just pointed out, it's a huge level. Like if you're a poor person living on minimum wage, struggling to make ends meet, you've already got a huge cash sink with your addiction that you have, $100 is an enormous punishment to you. That is why we have graduated tax brackets.
Yeah, you're in major debate mode right now. Just like talk about it though. Why is Portugal succeeding? Why are so many people able to afford this? Why is this working? I know that in the whole $100 is a huge amount. Of course you're going to go with that and everything, but I mean, just it's working. So
yeah, and I'm not saying, and that's not the only solution that could work. I'm pointing out that there is likely to be harm and there's not a distinct benefit, because I just read that article that you pointed out before. It says the benefits come from police discretion, and that police discretion comes in the form of fining instead of taking them to court. Why must it be decriminalized for that police discretion to exist?
So you agree with me that the goal, I mean, okay, so our goals are the same, right? Mm-hmm. So the only difference is you just don't want government to say, okay, it's decriminalized.
Well, because of all the associated harms, yes. Like the government.
So you still want the police to enforce it exactly the way I want the police to enforce it. You just don't want the government to say that's what they're doing.
No, you're the one arguing for decriminalization. It seems in tension. It seems in tension with the topic to argue that some punishment exists with decriminalization, because if something's not illegal, then why would you be punished for it? So what I'm pointing at here is the tension. It doesn't make sense.
That's what decriminalization is. That's here. I sent you the Wikipedia article about it just as a general read, but that's what the policy of decriminalization. There's a difference, and I saw the same thing. There was a policy in San Francisco where they were decriminalizing prostitution, and when you decriminalize something, it's different than legalizing it. When you legalize something, it means it's perfectly acceptable. There's nothing wrong with it. When you decriminalize something, it means there's a slight issue with it, but it will be up to you're not going to be hurt if you turn yourself in. In many cases, they get no fine. In many cases, they get no prison time. They get none of this sort of thing. Sometimes they might get a fine for it. So, but the point is, when you decriminalize it, you're saying, okay, we don't necessarily approve of what you have been doing, but we're willing to work with you. And so what they find is that that winds up costing less in the long term, because incarceration is incredibly expensive. But if you help people in advance, which is what decriminalization does, then you're able to prevent them from becoming a threat in the future. So you wind up saving money long term. All it means is that you spend a little bit of money to work with people, and in the long term, both they are benefited and society is benefited.
So my question then is, as I said like 5 minutes ago, what is the incentive for someone to come forward if they don't get, if in your world, no one ever gets fined, or very few people get fined and very few people get punished? Why would you bother coming forward? Like, if the government says, if you keep doing this, we're not gonna bother you, then they would probably just still stay addicted to the drug that they're on. They would probably still keep funneling their money into drug cartels, which use their funds for illegal purposes, and they'll be trapped in that poverty cycle where they have no chance of escape because they're addicted to a drug and they're coerced into continually taking it.
Because most people who are addicted to a substance feel a sense of guilt about that. And you keep talking about all the dangers that you don't keep talking about. Early on, you were talking about all the dangers associated with certain drugs. And a lot of people recognize that in themselves. You see a lot of alcoholics who are self-hating. And you see that with a lot of drug-addicted people too. These people recognize that they have a problem. And when a government tells them, you are bad and we're going to imprison you, especially if you are young, black, and male.
I didn't support imprisonment.
Okay, well, that's
right.
what the U.S. is currently doing, and that's
right.
the first outlawing and decriminalizing.
Yeah, but bro, the first words that came out of my mouth is, I don't have to support the silly drug laws that are instituted in the United States. The United States is good at a lot of things. It's definitely not good at this. But importantly, if drug abusers have a sense of guilt, what is the harm of the government then confirming that sense of guilt, which means that they're more likely to act upon it? If the government absolves them of that guilt by decriminalizing it, where is the incentive for them to come forward and avoid all of the social ills I just spoke about?
You're assuming there's a either we approve of it or we don't approve of it. But that's not
of course
really the way it works. No,
that's how the average person interprets the way in which the government acts. And that's the way in which they make their decisions.
Okay. So decriminalization is a government saying, okay, I recognize that you have a problem and I want to work with you on this problem. And what we have found is that when those programs are in place, either in US states or in countries that have tried it, people do come forward and the rates of drug addiction go significantly down. And we can talk about all those numbers, but I'd have to pull them up and everything. But I mean, there's pretty much any number you look at. Portugal, since 2001, has significantly gone down in their rates of drug addiction. So I know that you want to do the whole debate thing, and probably people aren't going to do this, and probably people aren't going to do this, but people do this. That's actually what you see. People do work with when the drugs are decriminalized. And it's because the government is neither saying, we think this is a good thing, and they're not saying, we think you're a bad person. They're not saying either of those things. They're saying, we think this is probably a problematic thing, but we're not going to attack you for it. We recognize that both you and society would be better off if we worked together on this. And what they find is that it works.
I don't think you've proven distinctness, but even if you have, right, think about this. If the government is saying you're not an enemy, which I do not have to do either, as I pointed out at many points.
Sure, I didn't say you had to.
Yeah. If you claim that it's still a bad thing that the government would prefer you not do, if you still engage in that behavior, if you still do things like funnel your money into cartels, more likely to commit crimes, more likely to commit petty theft, and more likely to ruin your children's lives because they're trapped in a poverty cycle. If you continue to do that, do you think the government should step in?
If someone does something that threatens the public, the government should step in. So
Okay.
in pretty much any of those examples, I'd say yes, probably.
All
but
right.
it wouldn't be because... sorry.
Yeah, if the drug rates go down by X%, there are still people doing those drugs. Would you have some punishment for them because they're still harming society, as you just conceded? Because it's really unclear how you help them.
The punishment is not on using drugs. The punishment is on abusing drugs or on abusing society. That's what Portugal did. That's why it works. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to work with people, and they don't even just say, okay, you're going to cold turkey stop doing drugs right now. No, because that wouldn't work. So sometimes they even incentivize people to slowly wean themselves off of drugs, and that has helped. And so that this is why the government isn't saying drugs are automatically bad. They say, okay, we think that drugs have a bit of an issue here. They have a problem, but we're going to help you. We're going to help you wean yourself off of it. And it's a much better approach than saying either drugs are good or drugs are bad.
Yeah, I said that too. What I'm pointing out here is that A, there will be less incentive for people to come forward under your side, and B, those people who do not come forward will continue to harm society. I'm not saying Portugal didn't work. I'm saying it is likely going to work less than the thing that I have proposed. And the reason for that is that there is a differential in harm and a differential in incentive. As I've said, every speech, can you please point out a distinct thing that decriminalization must have that I cannot have?
A completely different focus? I'm not really sure how in your system you're saying that.
Okay.
If drugs are illegal, then they are punishable, which is the whole difference here. When they're decriminalized, the punishment, if there is one, is incredibly small. And so people are incentivized to come forward about it. It's very different.
The mechanisms you point out are police discretion, increased information, and provision of services. For example, helping someone be rehabilitated who's addicted. Right. I'm pointing out, I'm happy to support all of those things too. Please, look, I'll say it and then I'll pass it to you. Less people are incentivized to go to the government under your side because they know that they don't have to, because they won't be harmed.
But that doesn't happen. Look, okay, some people might not want to go to the government because they're not going to be punished, and so they're not worried about it. Is what you're saying, I think.
All right, which means there's a group of people left. Yeah, which means there's a group of people left.
Going to continue to be problems. Sure. But what we find is that overall, the problem gets better.
I'm not saying the problem doesn't get better. I'm saying compare the way in which your problem gets better to the way in which my problem gets better. Your way doesn't have a mandate to help anyone post-fact. So if those people don't come forward, they get trapped in that cycle. My system is a system that would punish them and help them get out of that because I have a mandate to go and do that because I say it's illegal. You do not have that mandate because you've said it's now decriminalized.
I don't think you know what decriminalized means. But so it's just a different focus. When it's illegal, you can't have the same focus. And okay, I'm not. You really came in debate mode and everything. So with a minute left, where are we disagreeing exactly?
We're disagreeing in if whether or not people are going to come forward and how much they would come forward and what happens to the rest of the people who do not come forward.
Significantly more people come forward when they are being worked with as opposed to believing that government is out to get them.
Yeah, I can do that too. Where's your incentive to come forward?
In Australia, as we talked about, they have extremely high rates of people who are not coming forward, and their drug policies are still disproportionately affecting young black males. In Portugal, they don't have that. That's all it is. Look, I mean, I know that you wanted like just go debate mode and everything, but this is
this is a debating platform.
Yeah, but I was. It's not for a tournament, so we're just kind of talking about this. So, what Portugal has done has worked. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yeah, I never said that it didn't work. I'm saying it would work less than the thing that I'm proposing.
Yeah, but you didn't show that it works less than that. We even looked at the numbers, and apparently it's working more in
Except
Portugal.
for all of the logic, you know?